Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week number 5 for PPA 660, Organization Theory and Behavior. Hope everyone is having a good week so far, and this is our 5th of 6 Zoom sessions, so we are almost there. So since we are so far along in the course, let me just remind you of your remaining assignments and due dates. You have your final Canvas essay number 5, that is due on June 12th. Then next week, we will do our presentations next Wednesday, as many as we can get through. And then next Saturday, June 17th, will be our final wrap-up session starting at 9 a.m. And we will finish up all the presentations that we have not yet finished. And then also on that day by midnight, you then have your organizational analysis paper that you've been working on, hopefully for a while now, and so you'll have that due. And then you also will have your final assessment that's due as well. And that final assessment, again, is just that very simple organizational analysis for the one organization that we all share, which is Cal State Long Beach. Again, you're just going to be looking at examples of classical theories, examples of HR theories, and then examples of systems theory. So just those 3 aspects, and then that will satisfy the requirements then for the final assessment. By final assessment, you can be very concise in your answers. You don't have to write a whole lot of information. And I know that most of you do not work at Cal State Long Beach, and so you can be acquiring the information from your experience with the university so far in the DL program, as well as mining some of that information from the various university websites. But it's just a really mini, quick organizational analysis for Cal State Long Beach, and that's what comprises then that final assessment. So organizational analysis paper and final assessment due on June 17th. Your Canvas essay number 5 in responses to classmates due on June 12th. For tonight, what we're going to do is in the first half of class, we will talk about some of these, what I'd like to call more modern organization theories, and essentially wrap up our substantive information for the course, wrap up our tour de force through the history and development of the public organization theory literature. Then we'll take an evening break, and then once we're done with the break, we will come back, and we have 3 brave souls who have been kind enough to volunteer to do their presentations tonight, Kim, Balin, and Asail. And so we will do those 3 presentations after our break tonight, and then all the rest of them we'll then work through kind of in alphabetical order next Wednesday. If anyone would like to do theirs earlier next Wednesday as opposed to later, and you want to be one of the first people next week, please feel free to shoot me an email and let me know that, and we can certainly accommodate that. So let's see, we got a couple things in text chat. First, Adolfo's, I'll answer yours first. For the final assessment, yeah, you can certainly, as long as you turn in by midnight on June 17th, that Saturday, then it's considered on time. So you have the entire day on Saturday to finish up that final assessment. And Reggie, you have a question on the organizational analysis paper, so go ahead.
I'm curious. I recall it being 26 pages, or am I incorrect with that?
It's yeah, it's probably not going to be that long. It could be. It depends upon your organization that you're using. The page limit is not really a major issue for me, as long as you're addressing each one of those parts of the paper that I've listed there in the syllabus. As long as you're addressing all those elements, then it doesn't really matter if it's 10 pages or 20 pages or 30 pages, as long as, well, however long it takes you to do it, it is fine with me. You can be as parsimonious as you can be in putting the paper together. I would say, as a rule of thumb in the past, they tend to usually range between 10 and 15 pages, but that's just kind of past practice. Doesn't necessarily need to be in that page range.
Okay, and then did you want that double spaced or single spaced?
Double space, please.
Perfect, thank you.
Sure. Let's see, question about 697. Would the transcript show 2 parts or 1? Eventually you will be enrolled in 2 sections of 697. I don't know if Matt has enrolled everyone in both sections yet. You may just be enrolled in the first section. I don't know how he's processing the enrollments, but eventually, yes, your transcript will show that you've completed, or that you will have completed when you're done with the program, those 2 sections of 697. So the first section of 697 is technically with Dr. Butts. The second section of 697 is technically with me. And again, we'll just take the average of those 5 case study grades, and then that will then become your grade for both of those 2 sections of 697. But yes, there are 2 sections of 697 that will eventually show up on your transcript. Travis asked, are you supposed to upload the PowerPoint? You can, you don't have to. I have established a Dropbox and assignment box in our Canvas site. So you're welcome to submit your PowerPoint slides there. You don't have to though, because what I'm going to do is I will enable the session tonight as well as our next Wednesday and next Saturday sessions so that everyone has access to share their screens. So you can just share your slides when it's time for your presentation directly. So I don't have to have it in advance, but if you would like to submit it, there is an assignment Dropbox in the Canvas site for you. Good questions. Any more questions or clarifications or anything at all before we get going tonight? Again, if for some reason you want to be one of the first people next Wednesday, do send me an email and I'll kind of do first come, first serve. Otherwise, we'll just kind of go alphabetically in doing the presentations. Let's see, if Sale asks, if we are quoting Tompkins, do we need to make a reference page? There's a technical answer, there's another answer. That's a good question. The technical answer is yes. I mean, any references that you use, you should cite them, and you should have that citation in the reference page. Since this is the textbook that is common to all of us, I would ask that you do an in-text citation. So you'll do, say, in the parentheses, do Tompkins and the year of the publication. That at a minimum, you should do in-text citations. Technically, you should then also have a reference page with Tompkins in the reference page, but I'm not going to deduct any points if you don't. But I do want you to, in parentheses, in text, do Tompkins and the year, just so I know that's information that came from the Tompkins textbook. I'm not really going to adhere that closely to APA formatting for this paper. I'm not going to take any points off if you don't adhere completely to APA formatting, because honestly, I'm not a huge fan of the 7th edition of APA. I think a lot of the things that APA is requiring tend to be kind of counterintuitive, and I'm not a huge fan. They just don't make a whole lot of sense, especially in terms of the way in which you format your references. You know, having your article titles all in lowercase and then your journal titles in italics. It kind of seems strange to me, and I've never really liked it. But so, you know, try and use APA, but I'm not going to take any points off if it doesn't completely adhere to APA formatting. But yes, please do use an in-text citation just so I know where that information is coming from. If you are using a direct quote, and you shouldn't be using many, if at all, any direct quotes in the paper. But if you are using any direct quotes, please remember that direct quotes require a page number as well. That's an APA requirement. But again, I don't really anticipate a whole lot of direct quotes. For a paper like this, especially in a graduate program, every now and then you may want to use a quote to kind of grab your reader's attention. But other than that, you're not really using a lot of direct quotes. You're doing much more paraphrasing and putting the information in your own words, and then using the in-text parenthetical citation for that source. Good, very good questions. Any other questions before we get going? All right, if not, then again, what we're going to do is we're going to spend the first half of the class talking about some what I call modern organization theories. Now, admittedly, the term modern is kind of subjective in that some of these are from the 1950s or 1960s, but I group them in with modern organization theories because I think they do kind of recognize where the literature has evolved to, especially over the past few decades. And so when we talk modern organization theories, there are a lot of different theories that we can talk about, but just for the sake of time and for our sanity, I know we've covered a lot of theories, a lot of schools of thought over the past several weeks in this course. We're going to limit our discussion tonight to essentially 4 different schools of thought. We're going to talk about participative management theory, We're going to talk about quality management. We're going to talk about organization culture, one of my favorite schools of thought. And then we'll talk very briefly about leadership studies and the contribution that leadership studies have made to our understanding of organizations, and especially the effectiveness of public organizations. So we basically have 4 different schools of thought that we're going to talk about in the first half of class tonight. So let's go ahead and jump into it and start with participative management as our first school of thought. And in participative management, we're going to talk about a few different theorists. We're going to talk about Lewin, we'll talk about Lippitt and White, we will talk about Rensis-Leiker, and how this school of participative management really evolved over the series of a few decades. So in participative management, it's a school that is very much what it sounds like, in that it really does value the participation on the part of employees in the organization. Again, with the assumption that the more people participate, the more empowered they will feel, and the more buy-in you will have from those employees in terms of what you're trying to achieve together as an organization. So with participative management, we have really moved very far afield from where we were back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s with Max Weber and Frederick Taylor and Luther Gulick and Henri Fayol and those classical types of theorists. We have now moved very far away from classical theory. So in participative management, there is a recognition of the importance of groups and how groups can have an impact upon the behaviors of individuals. And again, that idea of focusing on groups really has its genesis with Elton Mayo and the Hawthorne experiments, but we really expound upon that now in this participative management type of school. One of the theories within the participative management school that really does emphasize the role played by groups on shaping individual behavior is a theory that I'm relatively fond of, and that's a theory known as field theory. Field theory is borrowed from the world of physics. And if you've ever taken a physics class, you've probably talked about field theory, and you've talked about how individuals and organisms exist within a field of influences and a field of stimuli. And in that field that everyone exists in, there are forces within that field that push people and motivate people to move in different directions and to do different types of things. And so we're constantly being forced to move and being pushed and pulled by all these different forces within this field in which we exist. When a person is being pushed in a direction or pulled in another direction by these forces, field theory says that that thing creates tension. And that tension is an uncomfortable state of being for an individual. People do not enjoy tension. They are uncomfortable when they feel tension. And so there is then a natural motivation to take the actions necessary to release that tension, and to release that tension by taking certain types of actions and engaging in certain types of behaviors. And tension tends to be released whenever a motivation has been satisfied. And within the context of organizational work, the motivation is oftentimes the motivation to accomplish unaccomplished tasks. So as individual employees, when we have tasks that have not yet been accomplished, we will feel a tension to accomplish those tasks, which will then motivate us to work toward the accomplishment of those tasks. So in field theory, whenever we're trying to explain why people do what they do and behave in the way in which they behave, we can understand their behavior as trying to reduce or eliminate this tension that's oftentimes caused by unaccomplished tasks. One thing that you probably notice in this class, and you'll certainly notice in future classes with me at least, is that I grade things very, very quickly. And whenever I log into the Canvas site and on the right side of my screen, I see that there are assignments that need to be graded. I need to go in and grade those assignments. And actually, Canvas, one of the things I don't like about Canvas that I really kind of bothers me from this kind of tension perspective is that whenever you're an instructor and you log into the Canvas site on the right side, if anyone submits a post to the discussion board, there'll then be a link that pops up that says grade discussion board number 1 or grade discussion board number 2. And that then tells you someone has posted a discussion board. But because we also require in this class responses to classmates, just because someone has posted a discussion board doesn't mean that that post is ready to be graded. That post isn't ready to be graded until that person responds to 2 colleagues. And so it's kind of the bane of my existence now that I sit there and see all these things that need to be graded, even though they are not ready to be graded. And so that's one of the things I don't like about Canvas. But I think that's a good example of how unaccomplished tasks create this tension, and then you are motivated to try and accomplish those tasks. But the basic idea behind field theory is that we exist in a field of forces. And these forces will then push us in different directions. Typically will usually push us in the direction of accomplishing things that we have not yet accomplished. And so the implication for that in terms of effective management is that leaders and managers need to clear the path of obstacles that are preventing employees from accomplishing those tasks. So one of the worst things that leaders and managers obviously can do is over-assign tasks to an employee, because then they don't have the time in order to accomplish tasks. And then they have a bunch of things that they are hanging out there that they have not finished because they keep getting new tasks added onto them. You need to afford them the opportunity to finish those tasks, release that tension, and then you have more satisfied and motivated employees. Another group of theories within participative management are what we call the autocratic versus democratic studies, oftentimes just known commonly as the Iowa studies. All of the Iowa studies, because they were conducted at the University of Iowa, usually they're ascribed to Lewin, Lippitt, and White as the 3 primary authors. And the idea behind the Iowa studies was that we wanted to understand the interaction between employees and leaders. And we want to kind of try and figure out what is the best way in order for a leader to interact with their employees. And so to study that, what the authors did is they established 2 different types of focus groups. One group they referred to as their autocratic group, and a second group they referred to as their democratic group. The autocratic group was led by a leader who was very top-down, very classical in their way in which they were managing employees. It was very much micromanagement, telling employees what to do, directing their actions, monitoring their actions, and taking a very classical, autocratic, type, almost dictatorship type of an approach to managing employees. And the second group was your democratic group, where the leader was much more democratic, allowed employees to participate in their own self-governance, in their own decision-making. Oftentimes, the leader would actually leave the room and let the people in the group work together on their own without the leader in the room to try and see what happens when you provide people with self-governance and self-determination. One of the interesting things in this study is that there was a mistake. And the mistake was that in one of those democratic groups, the leader took democratic leadership to an extreme. And rather than being a democratic leader, they became a laissez-faire leader, in that they completely took a hands-off approach, let the employees do anything that they wanted to do, didn't provide them any guidance or any support, basically just sat back and just let the group work on its own. That kind of created this third group unintentionally called the laissez-faire group. But what they found is the worst group was laissez-faire. If you provide no direction, if you provide no support, you take a completely hands-off approach, you're going to have a group that is not terribly productive. That's going to be the worst approach to take in terms of leading these employees. In terms of the autocratic group, they also found that that was lacking as well. And the problem with the autocratic group is that you had a lot of resentment that built up on the part of the members of the group. They felt that their path to goal attainment, their path to, if you want to call it a Maslowian self-actualization, was being blocked by this autocratic leader. And so they actually not only were very dissatisfied, but they also became very aggressive toward the leader. And some of the autocratic leaders actually feared for their safety because of the animosity that members of the group felt for their autocratic leadership style. And the reason why they became very aggressive, the reason why they sometimes threatened the autocratic leader is because they were trying to restore their lost stature. They were trying to restore that self-determination and self-governance and free will that they felt being removed from them by this autocratic leader. So it's no great surprise to us that it really was the democratic groups that operated most effectively and efficiently and were most productive. The Democratic group, the members of that group actually worked as a group even after the leader had left the room. And this really led Lewin, Lippitt, and White in their Iowa studies to really promote this idea of democratic organizations and democratic leadership. Now, again, this is something that's being done decades after Mary Parker Follett first talked about democratic organizations, but is just a reaffirmation of the idea of Mary Parker Follett that democratic organizations are the most effective and most efficient types of organizations. So this study led Rensis Leiker to develop this theory known in the school known as participative management. And you're probably familiar with Rensis Leiker. Leiker is probably best known for his response scales. And so when you do research methods, I'm sure you talked about Leiker ordinal response scales. This is the same Leiker. This is Rensis Leiker. But here, this is Leiker putting forth this school of thought known as participative management. Well, Leiker makes the argument that there are 4 possible management systems. The first management system is exploitative authoritative. In an exploitative authoritative approach, you have obviously authoritative leadership, very much top down, very much centralized control. And that centralized control is to exploit employees in order to get their contributions to make the organization effective and efficient. That should sound very familiar to us because that's very much that transactional leadership that we learned about with Chester Barnard. This is kind of your Barnard exploitative authoritative leadership approach. The second approach in participative management of the second possibility is benevolent authoritative approach. In the benevolent authoritative approach, you again have very much of a centralized command and control, top-down type of orientation, but that authoritative leader cares about their employees. They're a benevolent leader in that they do care about the wants, needs, and desires of their employees, and they do care about their employees as human beings, that their employees are valued as human beings. It's not just what you can get out of them to contribute to the organization. So obviously a benevolent authoritative type of system is going to be something that's more likely to satisfy employees than the exploitative authoritative type of model. The third model, possible model, is what he calls the consultative model. The consultative model is where you consult. You talk with your employees, you meet with your employees, you listen to your employees, but as a leader, you then go and make your decision on your own. So the consultative is oftentimes just to kind of placate employees, but employees really don't have a whole lot of say into those final decisions. Obviously, Leiker believed that the fourth model was the most appropriate model, and that's participative management. In participative management, Leiker talks about not only consulting with employees to participate in decision-making, allowing them to participate in their own self-direction and their own self-governance. So participative management really has its antecedents built into the human resource management type of a school. And so again, this is this movement away from the classical school, this movement more toward valuing individual human beings and allowing them to participate in their own management within the organization. So how do you accomplish participative management? According to Leiker, number one, you obviously have to establish supportive workplace relationships that are predicated upon trust. Number two, you have to facilitate group decision-making. Much like alpha male, you have to recognize the importance of both formal as well as informal groups, and then you have to facilitate decision-making by these groups. So you have to give them the resources and give them the time in order to be able to make these decisions and then implement those decisions. It's one thing to consult with people. It's one thing to allow people a seat at the table. It's a completely different matter in order to provide them with the resources to carry out the decisions that they are making. When in the future we take intergovernmental relations, I will talk to a lot about what we call the 3 Ds of Nixon's federalism. And the first 2 Ds are decentralization and devolution. And we'll talk about how decentralization and devolution are not the same term. In decentralization, you're essentially decentralizing decision-making to allow people to participate in the decision-making process. In devolution, you are providing the resources and devolving the power to those people so that they have the resources they need to then carry out the decisions that they are making. Decentralization without devolution would end up being more consultative as opposed to participative type of management. To truly have participative management, you need to have a combination of both decentralization as well as devolution of power and resources. So in terms of the principles of participative management and where they fit on our models for organizational effectiveness, our methods for control and coordination, and our methods for motivating employees. For our models of organizational effectiveness, the participative management school really does favor the human relations, internal processes, and rational goal models. So it favors 3 of those 4 models of organizational effectiveness. The only model that is not highlighted in the participative management school is that of the open systems type of organizational excellence model. Then in terms of our mechanisms for coordination and control, obviously, as you might have guessed, it's mutual adjustment in that we are talking with our employees, we're allowing our employees to participate in their own decision-making. In terms of how we motivate our employees under our participative management type of school, it's considerate leadership. Again, communicating with our employees, allowing our employees to participate in decision-making and self-governance. It's group acceptance, because obviously we have to recognize how important it is for groups to be allowed to thrive and to have the resources they need to make decisions in the organization. And then also job identification. Again, we want people to identify with the jobs that they are doing. They are more likely to identify with the jobs that they are doing if they have a hand in crafting those jobs and determining what types of tasks and what types of duties they are responsible for on a daily basis. So you can clearly see how the School of Participative Management really grows directly out of Mary Parker Follett, her democratic organizations, the Human Relations School, and then later on the Human Resource Management School with people like McGregor as well as Argyris. So we continue to move away from the classical school and this very top-down type of controlling approach to managing and running our organizations. Then a second school of thought that we typically talk about when we talk about the quote unquote more modern schools of organization theory is quality management, or QM. Now, you have probably run into QM in your organizations before. Quality management was a very popular approach to managing organizations, especially here in the US in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Quality management looks at if we can make for a quality process for producing our goods and services, that will then ensure quality for the goods and services that we are producing. The problem is that if you want to make sure that all the products and goods that you are producing are all of equivalent quality, it's difficult for you to measure every single good or service or product that you are creating as an organization. That is just too time consuming. We don't have the wherewithal to be able to measure the quality of every single product that's being created by an organization. So instead, in quality management, there's this process known as statistical process control. And we will apply statistics in order to assess the quality of what we are producing. Now, before we get into statistical process control, we have to pay homage to someone like Robert Merton from last week. Remember, we talked about Robert Merton and we talked about his middle range theories. We talked about how Merton really shifted our focus to the consequences of what we were creating. Are the products that we are creating having a positive impact upon our consumers? Here we are looking at creating a quality output so that quality output will then result in the types of outcomes, the types of consequences that we are trying to achieve for our consumers. So it's kind of rooted in this whole idea of Robert Merton and focusing on the consequences of what the organization is producing. Now, the primary champion of quality management, especially statistical process control, was Deming. And you may have read some works by Deming before. If you took any business classes, I'm sure you talked a lot about Deming. But the idea behind statistical process control is that in statistical process control, we will apply statistics in order to extrapolate quality to what we are producing. In other words, we cannot look at the quality of every single product that we are producing. So instead, we will take a random sample of those products, measure the quality of that random sample of those products, and then we will generalize our results to all the products that we are creating. So if in our random sample of products, we are identifying that we are meeting all of our quality standards, then we can, with certainty, or at least the confidence, 95% confidence, as you do in research, you can then assume that all of the things that we are producing meet those quality types of standards. Now, you know, with random sampling, how random sampling works. If you take a simple random sample, you will have external validity if your results from your sample then reflect the results from the population as a whole. So you have to do a good job of sampling in order to make sure your sample of products are representative or will be representative of all the products, the entire totality of the products that you are creating. So that's the idea behind statistical process control. You take this random sample from what you are creating, the products you're creating, and then use it to draw a conclusion about the quality of all the products that your organization is creating. Deming took this idea of statistical process control and quality management to American corporations. American corporations essentially turned their backs on it. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so Deming then took his theories to Japan and implemented statistical process control in Japan and quality control in Japan, had some great levels of success in Japan. American corporations saw how successful he was being in Japan with the types of goods and how high quality those goods were. And then American companies started to buy into quality management here in the US. When US corporations discovered quality management, they kind of rebranded it into this thing called TQM, or Total Quality Management. You may have lived through some TQM initiatives in your organizations. It was something that was very common, not just in the private sector, but also in a lot of public sector organizations as well. Total quality management is predicated on several different principles. The first principle is a customer focus. We focus on the wants, needs, and desires of the customer, and then how well do our products meet those wants, needs, and desires? Again, very much like a Robert Merton, what are the consequences for our customers of the products that we are creating? Second principle under TQM is total employee involvement. All employees are involved in the quality process. All employees are responsible for creating a quality output. So everyone is responsible, all employees are involved. It is very process-centered. Again, the idea being if we build quality into the process, that quality process will then result in a quality product. It's kind of like the old commercials from Ford that we build quality in. It's building quality into your process to then result in quality products. Integration of functions. We integrate functions in our organization so that all of our functions are contributing to the ultimate goal, which is creating this quality product or this quality output. It's very strategic and systematic in nature. Again, our ultimate goal is quality. And so everything that we do, all of our sub goals, all of our activities will then contribute to this idea of creating a quality product. It's predicated upon continuous improvement. We are continually improving the process, which will then continually improve the quality of the products created from that process. You've got that continuous improvement type of loop, that plan, do, check type of loop. Our decisions are based upon facts, so kind of like a Max Weber, we have fact-based decision making. We make our decisions based upon empirical information. And then we have an open communication system so that we can communicate problems in the process, the work processes, so that we know how to rectify those problems to then enhance the quality of the products that we are creating. TQM is a holistic, very intensive, time and resource intensive approach to building quality into your products and your goods as an organization. Has anyone lived through a TQM process in their organizations and can speak to TQM and your specific experience with TQM?
Dr. Powell, I can, but this is a private company that is in the field of quick service restaurants, and they have policies and procedures for everything. Everything has a purpose, and the purpose is quality and customer care. I cannot tell you how detailed everything is, and there's always a desire to make the product even better. So everything that you're saying really resonates with this specific company that I worked for a long time.
Good. Thanks, Estelle. And yeah, you're right. I mean, oftentimes we see this more in private corporations than we do in the public sector for some reasons we'll talk about on the next slide. But absolutely, everything is geared toward the quality of the product that's being created. Now, in the field like what you are talking about, that may be a little bit easier to measure quality in that field than it may be in a field in public administration, that it may be in terms of a social services type of department. And that's one of the big differences with TQM in a private organization as compared to TQM in a public organization. So as we implement TQM in public organizations, again, Deming is kind of the godfather, if you will, of TQM and quality management itself. Juran is another author who's very well known for quality management. And for Juran, he kind of had this tri-patriot, if you will, approach to quality management. Quality must be done on the planning side of the equation. We have to plan for quality in our products. We then have to control the quality in the process of producing the product. Then we have to survey the products that we are creating and identify opportunities for improvement in the quality of those products. Then you have this feedback loop that then takes you back to your planning phase. You take the information that you've acquired in your quality improvement studies, feed that information back into your planning process, change the way in which you are doing the process of creating the product, and then it just keeps looping. And you've always had this loop. Then you go back through controlling the process, implementing these new changes, then measuring the quality at the end again, identifying opportunities for improvement, then feeding that information back into the planning process, and so on and so on. Again, the whole idea that this is a loop of continuous improvement that really never ends. The problem, though, as we said, is sometimes it's more difficult to apply this in the public sector as compared to the private sector. And there are some obstacles that we need to overcome with quality management in the public sector. One of the major obstacles to implementing quality management in the public sector is structural fragmentation. We know we have a lot of fragmentation in the public sector in our public organizations. That fragmentation comes from the political environment in which we are operating. That fragmentation comes from fragmented authority, and that leaders and supervisors oftentimes have less authority over their subordinates than what you would see in the private sector. So that fragmentation sometimes makes it difficult for everyone to get on the same page in terms of the indicators of quality. A lack of incentives. We know we're very limited in the public sector with things like extrinsic monetary rewards. It's difficult for us to do pay for performance because it's difficult to measure performance, and it's also then difficult to get the buy-in of public employee unions to support pay for performance programs. And so we kind of have a lack of incentives for building in quality, especially incentives that come from extrinsic types of rewards. Third, in the public sector, we have a high turnover in leadership. And so quality management is really predicated upon quality planning. That quality planning will initially start with the leadership in the organization. When you have a lot of turnover in leadership, it makes it difficult for you to engage in the strategic planning process. And we know why we have so much turnover in the public sector. We've talked about that previously. Number 4, statutory barriers. Again, what we do in the public sector is predicated upon the enabling legislation that has established the agency and that has established the programs that we are implementing. That legislation will impose limitations on what we do and how we do it. Here in California, you're familiar with how the budget process works. And so even though we get a budget in June that's signed by the governor by June 30th, a lot of local agencies have to wait throughout the summer and into the early fall for all those trailer bills to get passed by the state legislature so that we know what are the specific requirements are in the implementation of these programs and these policies. There's a great deal of resistance to giving up power. And this is a common theme that we oftentimes see in the public sector. Since public leaders and managers have less control over their subordinates because of the career civil service system, because of public unionization, they need to find some other power resource. And that other power resource is oftentimes information and decision-making. And so it's tough for them to then delegate that power away because they are already at such a detriment, if you will, in terms of the amount of authority they have over their employees. And so there's some resistance among public leaders at times to give up and delegate power. A lack of resources. Certainly, to do a good job of quality management, you need to have resources. As that TQM can be a very resource and time-intensive type of process. We know that sometimes we lack those resources in public organizations. Conflicting goals. We know we have multiple goals and values in the public sector, and they oftentimes come into conflict with each other. Equity and efficiency oftentimes compete with each other as inherent values in the public sector. And our emphasis on equity is probably greater in the public sector than the emphasis would be in the private sector. So when you have these competing, conflicting, and multiplicity of goals and values, it makes it difficult for you to define what truly is quality in the products that we are creating. Now, lack of performance measures. When you think about the products that we are creating, as we all know in the public sector, they tend to be what we call softer types of goods and services and products that are much more difficult to measure from an empirical quantitative basis. And since we cannot measure them from an empirical basis, TQM is completely based upon empiricism. And if you cannot come up with these empirical measures for what you are creating as an organization, it's going to make it very difficult for you to engage in total quality management. And we know that it's much more difficult to measure the quality of a social service program that is meant to enhance the quality of life of a consumer or a citizen than it is to measure the quality of a widget that's being produced by a widget factory in our fantasy world of economics. And so it's much more difficult for us to have those performance types of measures. And for all those reasons, TQM is somewhat difficult to administer in the public sector. It is more common in the private sector, but I do mention it as one of these theories because it was a very common approach used in the public sector, especially in the 1980s and the 1990s. as we focus on reforming public organizations to try and make them more efficient and more effective. But we are much more limited in our ability to do it in the public sector. Then this third school of thought that we'll talk about tonight is, again, one of my favorite schools of thought. And before we get there, though, I don't want to neglect quality management in terms of doing what we do with all of our schools and going back and looking at where it fits with our models of organizational effectiveness, with our methods for coordination and control, and with our methods for motivating employees. With quality management, it really does highlight all four of our models of organizational effectiveness, because it really does depend upon what you are creating, what product you are creating, and the consumers that you are serving. We have rational goal because we know our ultimate goal is to create a quality product. We know that we're in an open system because we're worried about meeting the wants, needs, and desires of our stakeholders, of our consumers. So it takes us into that open systems type of model. We know we're in the human relations model because we are involving our employees in making these decisions about what constitutes quality. And we know that we also have an internal process model because we are trying to focus on the process, build quality into the process to then result in a quality output. In terms of our mechanisms for coordination and control, there is some mutual adjustment there because we allow our employees to participate in the definition of what is considered to be quality. And Giron, another contribution from Giron, is the idea of what he calls these quality circles. And so in our organizations, we'll create quality circles, each circle creating a different type of good, a different type of output. And then all those people who contribute to putting that good together, creating that good, all serve within this quality circle. So there's a lot of employee involvement in making these quality types of decisions. And then obviously there's a lot of standardization, because once you find a quality process that results in a quality output, you want to standardize those processes. So a lot of standardization of work processes, a lot of standardization of worker skills, and standardization of worker values in terms of placing this premium upon quality. Methods of motivation, we've got some considerate leadership and group acceptance with these quality circles. You have job identification, and you obviously have goal congruence, because the goal congruence is around this idea of quality. And producing a quality output is important not only for the organization, but also important for the individual employee. But that being said, moving into our third school of thought, again, one of my favorite ones is the school of organizational culture. And I don't know if you've run into organization culture before in the program, but I like organization culture school a lot because organization culture really does feed into this idea of contingency-based leadership and management. The idea of the appropriate answer is it depends. Every organization will have its own unique organization culture. So just like societies have their own cultures, countries have their own political cultures, organizations have their own organization cultures as well. And in terms of political cultures, you think about the United States, there are many different political cultures across the United States, depending upon oftentimes the region that you are in. And a couple of very famous federalism theorists, actually, Elazar and Grodzins, put together a study where they looked at all the different regions of the country to try and identify the differing political cultures. And what they found is that the culture in the Northeast was much different than the culture in the Southeast, which was much different than the culture in the Midwest. And they essentially identified three different political cultures that we have in the United States: an individualistic culture, a traditionalist culture, and a moralistic culture. In an individualistic culture, people participated in politics for what they could get out of it. And so you served in office, you contributed to candidates, you participated because you could get some benefit from it. In the traditionalist approach, politics was really geared around what has always been done, very much around the status quo. And so you do things today because that's how we've done them for the past 100 or 150 years. And that was primarily what they saw in the Southeast. That's why county government was one of the most important levels of government in Southeastern states. Then you had your third approach, which is the moralistic approach. And the moralistic approach, people participate in government because it's the quote unquote right thing to do. So you have three different cultures all within the same country. It's interesting. I lived in Florida for about a year teaching at a university in Florida. And the old adage in Florida is if you go far enough south, you are north again. And the idea there is you have so many people who have transplanted from the Midwest and from the Northeast down to Southern Florida that the political culture in Southern Florida, Miami and across the Alligator Alley to Fort Myers and Naples, in Southern Florida, that culture is much more like what you would anticipate seeing in the Northeast and in the upper Midwest than a Southern political culture. So again, you go far enough south, it's like you are north again. Same type of thing with organizations. Every organization has its unique organization culture. And the most appropriate way to study organizations and to create effective organizations is to do so through an understanding of that organization's culture. So my question to you is define for me what we mean by culture. What is culture? What do we mean by the term culture? So we throw that term around a lot and we say, well, we've got our own unique culture here in the United States, which is different than the culture in England. We say, you know, Massachusetts has a different political culture than Florida does or than Texas does. So what do we mean by culture? Culture is essentially what? Our values? Yeah, there we go. Our system of shared beliefs, system of practices, system of assumptions. Yeah, it's shared beliefs, it's shared values, it's shared norms, it's shared expectations. Expectations for behavior. So a culture really expresses what the norms and the values and the beliefs and the assumptions of that group of individuals really is. And so organizations have their own set of beliefs and norms and values and expectations. And that makes up the organization's culture. Now, there are three different levels of organization culture. And so in the School of Organization Culture, you would study an organization in much the same way in which you would study an ancient society's culture. So if you want to study an ancient society's culture, you're probably going to go on an archaeological dig. On that archaeological dig, you are going to dig up artifacts, things like eating utensils, that will give you some insight into how those people in that ancient society live their daily lives. And their practices that they followed, you will get that through all these artifacts that you dig up on your archaeological dig. Organizations create artifacts as well. These artifacts are visible, tangible indications of organization culture. So things such as meeting agendas, those are artifacts of organizations. They tell us what people talked about in these meetings, what was important enough to talk about. Minutes from meetings are important artifacts of an organization. Policy and procedure manuals are important artifacts of an organization because they show us, again, the expectations for behavior in our policies and our procedures. Those are very visible. Those are very tangible indications of organization culture. We refer to those as artifacts. They're very easy to come by. They're very easy to study. We just, our program just finished up our reaccreditation with NASPA, and we're waiting in about another 1 or 2 weeks, we'll get our reaccreditation letter. But NASPA wanted to see agendas and minutes from our faculty meetings to see who participated, see the types of topics that we talked about, how we resolved those topics, and was it a unanimous vote? Was it a split vote, which would show some dissension among members of the faculty? So those are artifacts that NASPA wants to see in the reaccreditation process. So we produce these artifacts all the time. They're very readily acquired. The second level of culture are what we call the espoused values. Espoused values are the goals and the objectives of the organization. So when the organization puts together its strategic plan, in that strategic plan, it will say, this is what we are trying to achieve. Here are the goals we're trying to achieve and how we are trying to achieve those goals. Most organizations will have a mission statement and a vision statement. And you're familiar with the difference between mission and vision statements. A vision statement is essentially, this is where we see ourselves in the future. This is the organization that we want to be. The mission statement is, this is who we are and this is what we do. So mission statements, vision statements, strategic plans, goals, and objectives, those are all those espoused values. Again, they are values that the organization is telling you about. They're saying, this is who we are, this is what we value. So again, they're pretty readily acquired, maybe not as easily acquired as agendas and minutes, but they're out there and they're relatively easy to see those espoused values, because again, they are espoused values. It's the third level of culture that is much more difficult to ascertain, and that level is the basic assumptions level. There are basic assumptions that everyone in the organization shares, but we don't talk a lot about them. We share these assumptions for behavior, but we don't really go out there and talk about them. Since they are basic assumptions that we don't talk a lot about, it's more difficult for someone external to the organization to come in, study the organization, and learn what those basic assumptions are. So some of our basic assumptions, treating people with civility. Now, more and more organizations are creating civility codes, especially as people return to the office after the COVID pandemic. But traditionally, a lot of organizations didn't have civility codes. It was just an assumption that we treat everyone with respect, we treat everyone in a civil manner, we treat everyone as colleagues. We just all kind of knew that. That's a basic type of assumption that will then guide behavior. So you can kind of view this kind of as if you want to look at like a bullseye type of analogy, in that in the center, you've got your assumptions. Those are very difficult to get at. Then the next ring out is your espoused values. They're much more attainable. And then finally, your outside ring are your artifacts, which are easily seen and easily measured by anyone who is studying the organization. But understanding the espoused values and the basic assumptions of the organization is important, because once you understand the culture of the organization, then the behaviors of that organization tend to make a lot more sense to you. Now, leaders, when they come into organizations, have the ability to embed culture into their organizations. They can embed these basic assumptions and these values into organizations, and that's part of the strength of a leader. So if you have a very transformational, visionary leader, they come into the organization, they want to embed their own culture into the organization. Now, there are two different types, two categories of embedding mechanisms, ways in which you can embed culture into an organization. The first category of embedding mechanisms are what we call the primary embedding mechanisms. So a primary embedding mechanism could be something like looking at what leaders pay attention to, what they measure, and what they control. So if a leader is paying attention to something, then that really signals everyone else in the organization that this is something that leader values. This is something that we probably should value as an organization. How leaders react to critical incidents and crises. So how the leader reacts to a crisis can also embed culture into the organization. So most of our organizations operate in a dynamic, open type of environment. So we've got a lot of challenges that we're being faced with. How leaders react to those challenges will then again clue in members of the organization in terms of how they should then react to these critical incidents and these crises. There's a body of literature that's a really interesting body of literature that looks at how leaders respond to a crisis and what types of skills they use to respond to a crisis. Typically, in a crisis situation, leaders tend to fall back upon their experience to respond to a crisis, where in non-crisis situations, leaders tend to fall back upon their knowledge. So knowledge is more important in non-crisis situations. Experience is more important in a crisis situation, which makes sense because you have to react very quickly. If you have the experience, you can then react quickly. You don't really have the time to sit down and think about everything you covered in your DLMPA program to respond to that crisis in an immediate manner. Observe criteria by which leaders allocate scarce resources. So we know we have finite resources and infinite demands. So how do these leaders allocate those scarce resources? Those criteria that they use also can embed culture into the organization. Deliberate role modeling, teaching, and coaching. There's a theory in management known as social learning theory. It's part of cognitive theory. And in social learning theory, people learn by watching others. They learn by seeing others role playing. They learn by living vicariously through others. And so that's a way in which you can embed culture. Observe criteria by which leaders allocate rewards. And so what do you get rewarded for will then obviously shape your behavior in the future. And then observe criteria by which leaders recruit, select, promote, and at times excommunicate members from the organization. Again, signals to employees what is important, what is valued, perhaps what is less important and not quite as valued. So those are what we call the primary embedding mechanisms that leaders can use to embed culture into an organization. Then you have a second category known as the secondary embedding mechanisms. And secondary embedding mechanisms can be things such as organization design and structure. So what the organization structure looks like. Is it a very top-down hierarchical system? Is it a much flatter type of hierarchy? That will communicate culture as well. If it's a very flat hierarchy, then we value participation on the part of employees. We value employees being creative, being innovative, and taking risks. If it's a very top-down, very tall hierarchy, probably we value subordination. We value people knowing where they fit in the organization and knowing to whom they are responsible for their actions. Organizational systems and procedures, the processes and procedures that we use. By changing those processes and procedures, we can then again embed culture into the organization. One that I'm really fond of is the design of physical space. How we design physical space can have an impact upon the culture of that organization. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples. One example comes from the urban governance literature, and it looks at public housing projects. And there is one very famous public housing project that was known as Pruitt-Igoe. And in the Pruitt-Igoe housing project, the way in which the physical space was designed was a very dehumanizing approach, and it had a very negative impact upon the residents who lived there. And so the residents who lived there hated the building, they hated where they lived, and so therefore they weren't all that concerned about taking care of the building. To give you an example, in this Pruitt-Igoe public housing project, it was built so that elevators did not stop on every floor. And so you'd have elevators that would stop on even numbered floors. And so if you lived on the third floor, you would have to take the elevator to the second floor and walk up a flight of stairs, or take the elevator to the fourth floor and then walk down a flight of stairs. Obviously, that's a very dehumanizing approach in terms of the way in which that structure was organized, the way in which the structure was built. We learned a lot from the impact of physical space on how people feel and how people behave. Another example, a more recent example from my past, is when I was on the school board in a school district. We had come to the realization that on the second floor of the district office is where all the fiscal staff worked. And the fiscal staff never really interacted with each other. They also didn't interact with anyone else in the organization. It was kind of like no one really knew what was going on up in the fiscal office. And so what the district decided to do is it decided to redesign the physical space so that people were not working in these cubicles. And so rather than having these cubicles with these high walls, they then created lower walls and created a much more open floor plan where people have places where they could collaborate and to work together. And again, that redesign of that physical space was intended to make people collaborate more and make people work together and interact more on a daily basis. So physical space can have an impact upon the culture of the organization. Stories, legends, myths about people and events can also have an impact upon the culture of the organization. And I'm sure in your individual organization, there are some legends and there's some myths about something that happened many years ago that certainly probably contributes to the current culture of the organization. And then formal statements of organization philosophy and values. So actually come up with new statements. What is the philosophy of the organization? What do we value as an organization? That as well can then embed culture into the organization. So the moral of the story here is to understand an organization, why it does what it does. We must first understand the unique culture of that organization. Organization cultures can change, they can morph over time. And sometimes our older, larger, more fragmented organizations will have a much different culture than the culture that they started with maybe decades before when that agency was first established. So cultures can change, and a lot of that change comes from the embedding of culture by new leaders as they enter into the organization. So organization culture theory in terms of our models of organizational effectiveness, again, it depends. And so it's going to highlight all four of those models. It depends upon the organization, depends upon the values of that organization. And so you've got all four of those models highlighted with organization culture school. In terms of our mechanisms of coordination control, it really ends up being a standardization of values, because when we are embedding a culture in the organization, we are trying to standardize values across the entire organization. So it's very much standardization of values as a way to coordinate work that goes on within the organization. And then in terms of our methods for motivation, goal congruence. Again, if we have established a strong culture, where we have shared assumptions and we have shared values, then we're also going to have shared goals. And those shared goals then give us this goal congruence between individual goals as well as organizational goals. So when we talk about organization culture school, I think that's really what brings us completely away from the classical school, because now we are completely in the contingency situational based type of field. So that we have to look at the context of the situation to understand the organization. It is no longer a panacea. It is no longer a one best way to do the job, no longer a one best way to structure the organization, no longer the one toolkit of skills to give to our managers. Now it's a much more complex contingency-based way of studying organizations. The good thing about that is I think it's a more appropriate way of studying organizations. The downside is there's a lot more complexity, and it makes it much more difficult for us to study and understand our organizations. And then the fourth school of thought, if you want to call the school of thought that we cover, is what I like to call leadership studies. And leadership studies kind of cobbles together a lot of different theories together into one school. Reggie, go ahead.
Dr. Paul, I have a question. When we look at cultural strength and the concept of embedding culture by new leadership, can it seems like it would be a positive, more forward thinking, but is it possible to have fluctuations where it starts out very classical, then becomes more of an HR model, and then goes back to classical? I'm assuming that is possible because every leader is different. So it doesn't mean that it's constantly improving, quote unquote, but can fluctuate depending on the stylistic nature of each leader.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that you're right. That's a very important point, that it's not necessary. There's always this unbroken trajectory for the better in the embedding of culture. As you point out, every leader can have a different culture that they bring into the organization. And so this cultural development can actually be full of what we call fits and starts.
Okay.
Yes, you may have one leader that really does value a flatter type of organization with a lot of communication, a lot of delegation of decision-making authority. That person leaves, another leader comes in that's a much more micromanager, much more of a top-down type of approach. So yes, we can ping pong back and forth between micromanagement and delegation, depending upon the the approach of that leader.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep, and I'm glad you mentioned that. That's an excellent point. And I know, just speaking from my experience here at Long Beach, is I've been here for a while. I've been here now 22 years, and in my 22 years here, I think that I have lived through 6 different dean administrations, at least 6, might be more by now. I lose count after a while, but and I've seen different deans come in with different cultures that they've embedded. Some deans have come in; they've been very micromanagement. They've micromanaged the departments. They want uniformity across all the departments and everything that departments do. And I've had other deans that have been much more hands-off and let departments do what they want, because departments, they're the experts in their academic discipline. And so therefore they should have the flexibility and the breathing room to make their own decisions. And sometimes I've really seen that ping pong back and forth between approaches from different deans. That's something we've really become very familiar with, I think, in our system of American government as well, in that we have seen with successive administrations, each new administration tends to try and undo what the previous administration did.
Correct,
And so,
correct.
yeah, we saw the Obama administration came in and tried to undo some of the things done in the Bush administration. We saw the Trump administration come in and try and undo what was done in the Obama administration. Now the Biden administration's undoing what was done in the Trump administration. And just kind of we ping pong back and forth between these extremes. And that it can be dangerous, because again, it can lead to more polarization politically within our country, but it can also lead to a lack of trust, in terms of foreign relations with some of our allies, where they really don't know if they should make a deal. Should I make a deal with the current administration? If that current administration's out of power in a year and there's another administration that has a completely different perspective, why make a deal now? Why don't I just wait for the next administration? And so I think we kind of see it on a macro level politically as well in our current political environment. So, but that's a very important point. Yeah, it can really ebb and flow depending upon the leader that's in power at that time.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And so this fourth approach here, I'm just kind of cobbling a bunch of stuff together in leadership to call it leadership studies. Leadership really has become an important domain in the organization theory literature, especially over the past couple of decades. The literature really has started to return its attention to the importance of leadership on organizational effectiveness. Now, we had already talked about Lewin and those Iowa studies and the autocratic, democratic, and laissez-faire leadership groups, and whereby the authors determined that participative type of management, participative type of leadership was probably I won't want to say the best, but was the most appropriate way of leading successful organizations. And there is a distinction in the literature between management and leadership that I think we do need to acknowledge at this point. When we are talking about the difference between management and leadership, the primary difference is that managers allocate resources. So if you're a manager, you are managing these precious resources and you are allocating those resources on a daily basis. Leaders may allocate resources, but they don't necessarily allocate resources on a daily basis. They provide sometimes more the vision of the organization, and then the resources then get allocated by managers. If you think about in a university setting, the university president tends to be the leader, establishes the vision, is the face of the university. Oftentimes today goes out there and raises money, because that's what university presidents spend most of their time doing these days. And then the management is then left to the provost office, and the provost then becomes the manager of those scarce resources. And so whenever you want to get a tenure track hire line, you don't go to the president, you go to the provost. If you want to get additional lecturers in your college, you go to the provost, you don't go to the president. So there is this difference between leadership and management. I think, tonight we're kind of conflate the two together, because there is so much overlap between management and leadership, but the primary difference is the allocation of resources. But Lewin and his co-authors told us about the importance of participative management or participative leadership, and how important it was to afford our employees the opportunity to participate in their own self-direction and their own self-governance. Historically, though, in the leadership literature, the approach was what we call a trait-based approach. You basically have two different approaches to leadership. You have the trait-based approach, and you have the behavioral-based approach. The traditional approach is the trait-based approach. And the trait-based approach says that there are some common imbued traits of individuals that make them effective leaders. And so if you have traits such as confidence, if you have traits such as persuasiveness, those types of traits are usually associated with effective leadership. And it's kind of a situation, either you have them or you do not have them. Recent research has really found no relationship between certain traits and effective leadership. And essentially what we have learned is that you're not born to be a good leader, but instead you can learn to be a good leader, which is important for us in MPA programs. It's important for us because you can teach leadership, you can learn leadership skills, and you can learn leadership behaviors. So the literature really has moved away from the trait-based approach to leadership and has really moved more to behavioral approach. The behavioral approach is really rooted in two seminal studies, one conducted by Ohio State University and the other one conducted by, as we say at Ohio State, the University up north. And that University up north, otherwise known, I'll say it one time, as Michigan. But Ohio State and the University up north, those two studies really set the groundwork for understanding of the behavioral approach to leadership. The Ohio State studies, which were done in the 1950s, established two different criteria for leaders, a structural approach and a consideration approach. Leaders who took a structural approach were leaders who really favor productivity and achieving the goals of the organization. Leaders who were more in the consideration camp were those who were concerned about building relationships with their employees. The Michigan studies then picked up on the Ohio State studies, and it's important to know Ohio State studies came first, and then the Michigan studies kind of duplicate the Ohio State studies, but they use different terms. Michigan studies, they refer to leaders as being either production-oriented or employee-oriented. Production-oriented is very similar to the Ohio State term of structure-oriented. Employee-oriented is very similar to the Ohio State term of consideration-oriented. So different leaders, depending upon where they are on that spectrum of employee orientation or production orientation, will lead differently. And we have to understand where you are as a leader on this spectrum between employee versus production orientation. Now, some leaders tend to be very charismatic and they lead through their charisma. That's, as we all know, called charismatic leadership. We've probably all worked for a charismatic leader before. We know that charismatic leaders tend to engender a lot of loyalty among their followers, and that's one of the strengths of charismatic leadership. The disadvantage of charismatic leadership is that the power and the authority of the leader resides within the individual rather than within the office. So if the power and authority and legitimacy for that leader resides within that individual themselves, if that individual leaves the organization, and we know in the public sector we have a lot of leadership turnover, if they leave the organization, they take the repository of power and authority with them when they leave. As opposed to if you have the power and authority vested within the office, that's a much more stable and permanent type of authority, and that the office will be there even after the person leaves. So the advantage of a charismatic leader, they engender a lot of loyalty among their followers. The disadvantage is that their leadership, their power that comes from their leadership tends to be very transient and very temporary, and then is attached to the person rather than being attached to the office. You can also then have what are called transactional leaders, and this is very much like Chester Barnard's approach. You make transactions with your employees. You provide your employees with the right inducements, the right incentives, and then your employees will provide the contributions that you need to the organization to make you successful as a leader. There's a body of literature, not to get too far down the road in this direction, but there's a body of literature that looks at the leadership of mayors in big cities. And the transactional type of mayor is what the literature refers to as the broker type of mayor. They broker these relationships, they broker these deals with their employees in order to get the contributions that they need to try and make them and their organizations successful and effective. I'm sure we've all worked for transactional leaders before, and you kind of know that transaction that goes on between a leader and an employee. Then you can have transformational or visionary leaders. A transformational leader is someone who comes in with a new vision for the organization. This is someone who comes in and wants to fundamentally alter the culture of the organization and take that organization in a different direction. Transformational leaders obviously can be very advantageous if you have a dysfunctional organization. That transformational leader can come in and embed a new culture and then hopefully make that organization much more successful. The problem with transformational leaders is that you burn up a lot of your political capital as a transformational leader. It takes a lot of resources, a lot of time, and a lot of effort for you to embed this new culture and this new vision into your organization. What the literature has found, though, is that most effective leaders lead by contingencies and situations. And this idea of situational leadership is actually something that is as old as Mary Parker Follett's theories back in the 1920s. She talked a lot about leading by situation. That's kind of where the organization of leadership literature is now, is that sometimes you have to be transactional, other times you're able to be more transformational. It's oftentimes a leader is not all one or all the other. And it's really a balance between the transactional and the transformational in what we refer to as contingency-based leadership. But let me show you, I'll just skip to this one to make it a little bit quicker for you. Let me show you what William Redden refers to as the 4 different styles of contingency-based leadership. And these 4 different styles of contingency-based leadership are predicated upon all the way back to the Ohio State studies and this idea of concern for performance versus concern for people. So if you have a leader who is not terribly concerned about their employees, and they're also not terribly concerned about performance, they're going to be in the bottom left-hand cell, what we call the laissez-faire leader. A laissez-faire leader, they will be uncomfortable. People are uncontrollable. They're uncomfortable working with these people. And so leaders tend to just try and stay out of trouble. They take their hands off the wheel of leadership. They basically say, do what you're going to do. I'm not going to get myself involved in it. Very hands-off, laissez-faire leadership. Typically, that doesn't work very well in most of our organizations most of the time. But that's someone who's low on concern for performance, low on concern for their employees. The top of the chart there, you have low concern for performance, high concern for people. This is a human relations leader. Sometimes people refer to this pejoratively as country club leadership. In a human relations approach, a country club type of approach, this type of leader is interested in generating strong, supportive relationships with their employees. They're concerned about fellowship with their employees, but they're not as concerned about accomplishing the goals of the organization. So again, that's why it's kind of called country club type of leadership. Then your bottom right-hand cell, that's your autocratic leader. Very concerned about performance and productivity, not a whole lot of concern for your employees. These autocratic leaders rely upon authority and top-down management with very little employee involvement, very little efficacy on the part of individual employees. And then your top right-hand cell is probably where we hope to be as a leader, and that's a democratic leader. We try to combine organization and personal goals. You have a high concern for accomplishing organizational goals and a high concern for the well-being of your employees. So most of the time with Redden's 4 styles of contingency-based leadership, we hope to be in the democratic cell. We hope to be democratic leaders. Sometimes we have to be a little bit more concerned about our employees. If our employees are going through difficult times, then we may have to pay more attention to our employees, even if that does cost us a bit in terms of productivity and performance for the organization. We very rarely want to be in that bottom cell of laissez-faire leader because it then becomes chaos within the organization. But I think where the literature currently is in terms of leadership is, you can all say it with me together, it depends. It depends upon the situation in which we find ourselves. Sometimes we are going to be more transformational. Sometimes we're going to have to be more transactional. Sometimes we're going to have to focus more on productivity. And other times we're going to have to focus more on the people within our organizations. And if you want to tie all the organization theory literature together from the late 1800s until today, I think that one thread that really ties all the literature together is this progress away from the one size fits all approach and the search for that panacea to the acceptance of the contingency based approach to organizations. It really does depend upon the situation in which we find ourselves. And I think that's really been the trajectory that we have seen over the past 150 years in terms of the development and evolution of the organization theory literature. My goal was to get through all that information by 7:30 and it's 7:25. So I guess we were more productive than I thought we would even be. Do you have any questions about any of these more modern theories, participative management, quality management, organization culture, or these leadership studies and their import and their impact on how we study and understand our organizations? Again, there are a lot of other theories that we could have covered in this class, but we do have this limited amount of time, and I do think it's very important that we leave time for you to do your presentations so that we can accomplish that fifth universal required competency of the ability to communicate effectively, communicate and interact effectively and productively with a diverse workforce and citizenry. That's one of the major required competencies, one of the 5 that we need to demonstrate as a NASPA accredited program. And one of the places we demonstrate that is here in this organization theory course with those presentations. So this way we can dedicate the last half of class to our 3 presentations for tonight, all of next week's class to our presentations, and then wrap all the remaining presentations up then on Saturday. Okay, if we are all good, then let's go ahead and take our break for the evening, and I'll be able to get rid of these slides, and we'll come back and we'll do our 3 presentations for the evening. We have Kim, we have Belin, and we have Assail, and so we'll do those 3 presentations. If anyone else feels the desire to do a presentation tonight after we finish those 3 presentations, we'll probably have a little bit of time left that someone else could do a presentation if you would like. Otherwise, we'll finish up all the other presentations next Wednesday and next Saturday. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's take a break until 7:40. We'll come back at 7:40 and then we'll have Kim, we'll have you on deck then at 7:40 to do your presentation, and then Belin, and then we will go and do our 3rd presentation with Assail. So we'll start with Kim. We come back at 7:40. Okay, so take a break, come back at 7:40, and we'll start our presentations. Okay, welcome back at 7:40. So let's do our 3 presentations for tonight. Again, the presentations are informal. I've set up the session so that it's open for screen sharing. So you can just, when it's time for your presentation, just share your screen. Yeah, about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, I think is certainly sufficient for the presentation. So without further ado, we'll start off with Kim. So Kim, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Hello, thank you, Professor. Let me share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that?
Looks good.
Okay. All right, well, good evening. For my organizational analysis, I selected the city of Fullerton, and tonight I will be discussing the administration department. So the city of Fullerton is a public nonprofit organization. It operates through a council manager form of government in which its citizens elect their council members to make important decisions on policy related issues. The city of Fullerton has over 400 employees and 11 departments within its organization. This includes administrative services, the Fullerton Airport, the office of the city clerk, the office of the city manager, community development, the fire department, human resources, the Fullerton Library, a police department, parks and recreation, and public works. Within the administration department is the Office of the City Manager and the Office of the City Clerk. The Office of the City Manager serves as the administrative head of the City of Fullerton and is responsible for implementing the policies and directives set by Fullerton City Council. They provide policy direction for fiscal planning and leadership to the city's executive managers and the organization as a whole in ensuring the needs of the community are met while coordinating the provision of a wide range of municipal services. The city manager's office also provides essential public communications to residents, responds to media inquiries, and administers the citywide training program, including health and wellness programs. The city clerk's office serves as the clerk of the council. The office administers municipal elections, is the filing officer for campaign and economic interest statements that are required by the Political Reform Act, and is the custodian of the city seal. The city clerk's office is the record center for official actions of city council and is responsible for related agendas, minutes, and public hearing notices. The administrative department is staffed by the city manager, deputy city manager, senior administrative analyst, executive assistant, clerical assistant, administrative intern, city clerk, and deputy city clerk. So because the city of Fullerton is a public municipal organization, it serves in the interest of the public. Therefore, organizational performance and effectiveness is key for a city like Fullerton to be successful. Some of the ways in which the administration department strives to be successful is by coordinating work activities. For example, practicing activities such as mutual adjustment, where employees across various departments are continuously consulting with each other and reporting to the city manager to assess and discuss needs and how to get those needs accomplished. The city manager's department ultimately sets the standard of work progress, work outputs, worker skills, and values by employing executive staff and communicating the visions of city council to those staff members. As it relates to political authority, the administration department has the ultimate authority within the organization. However, the city manager reports to the city council, who is elected by the public, making the public the ultimate figures of authority. An element that reflects Weber's ideal of bureaucracy as it relates to the administration department is hierarchy of authority and written documentation. In Fullerton, positions are arranged like a pyramid and listed according to their authority. The roles of superior and subordinate relations are clearly defined and recorded in written documentation. There is a clear hierarchy in who can approve purchases and make decisions. An element that reflects Taylor's scientific management is task specialization. Every position in the city of Fullerton has clear tasks defined by their positions. These tasks are further protected by unions that ensure that people in positions are not doing work beyond their scope. It also ensures that task specializations are listed under a proper rate scale for pay. So the way the administration department functions is by obeying the law of situation. That means by doing what needs to be done according to principles or methods discovered through joint investigation by everyone who is involved, both employees and supervisors. This is especially relevant during city council meetings where direction on an item is given to the city manager. That direction doesn't just apply to the city manager, it also applies to all the various departments that are involved. After a city council meeting, coordination and control are then accomplished by both the city manager and the department. And this is done behaviorally rather than structurally. This theory is helpful because there is a mutual understanding of what needs to be accomplished rather than a written or formula rule or formal rule. It also creates a collaborative environment where multiple people have the same goals and willingness to accomplish them. Because the department head is the lead in making managerial decisions, behind those decisions are assumptions about human nature and behavior. This is shown in looking at past practices and policies within the department. An example at the city of Fullerton is how a previous city manager felt that solid waste management should be managed within the administration department instead of the public works department. And that was simply because it was something that person felt was more in line with their personal interests. But now, under a different city manager, the solid waste management functions will be transferred back to the Public Works Department. This is an example of how things have changed and shifted with each city manager, and this is because each of those city managers' decisions reflect their own assumptions. So the City of Fullerton's administration department represents Management System 3, the consultative. Did I say that right? This is because within the city, responsibility lies at the top with the city manager and department heads, who are the main individuals that make decisions. And other employees are also involved in this decision-making process, and communication is open between employees and their supervisors, but ultimately the decisions are up to the city manager. The City of Fullerton is consciously structured in its functions, goals, and objectives. The administration department is the most important when it comes to seeking to satisfy the requirements of the organization as a whole. Because administration plays such an important role to the organization, using rewards to induce desired behaviors is one key to success. The city manager rewards for performance in ways such as pay increases, employee recognition events, and promotional opportunities. These incentives encourage employees to exceed expectations put on by the city manager because they value good reputation, higher pay, and advancement in their careers. The administration department also promotes considerate leadership as it is the main department that oversees special events such as Public Works Week, summer luncheons, prizes for employees, holiday parties, etc. This creates a work environment that boosts morale because employees are encouraged to bond, and it makes employees feel appreciated, respected, and supported. A continuous obstacle in the administration department is stakeholder satisfaction, which is the fundamental quality management theory in the city as a whole. Ensuring that the individuals and groups who have vested interest in city functions are satisfied is what keeps the city running smoothly and successfully. Continuously measuring satisfaction by using tools such as surveys, interviews, holding public meetings can all help gather qualitative and quantitative information to help the administration department understand the stakeholders' perspectives, opinions, and preferences. And then they use that information to improve quality and performance for all the departments in the city. Continuous improvement is another vital management theory. This ensures that the administration department is always striving to be successful and searching for new tools to achieve success. It is especially important for the city manager to understand how all employees in the city are performing and ways in which performance can be improved. This includes identifying opportunities that help employees do their jobs, implementing small changes such as software programs to make tasks easier for employees, and constantly searching for ways to do things better that will not only motivate employees, but will progress the city in terms of workflows, programs, and services, both internally and externally. Independent work systems is probably the most important aspect of quality management in the administration department. This is because quality is determined by the city manager and the executive leaders that the city manager oversees. Together, these individuals create the systems that determine performance outcomes. And since the concept of interdependent work systems serves to redirect management's efforts to improving the systems where employees work rather than focusing on the control of those people who work in the system, problem solving in the city of Fullerton is focused on more than who or what created the problem, but solving the problem. A clear example of this is when there is miscommunication on a project. Most recently, there was a request for proposal that went out and it was not sent to the proper organizations because it was not communicated who should receive that RFP. Rather than pointing fingers about who didn't relay the message and why, the focus was to ensure that moving forward, there was a system put in place for employees to follow when releasing RFPs. This helped improve the system. The open systems model can be used to ensure the city of Fullerton remains flexible and adaptable to the ever-changing environment of employees, services, and populations within the city. Currently, the city of Fullerton faces obstacles as it relates to quality management. For example, in recent years, retention and attraction of employees, especially senior and executive staff, has been difficult. The administration department struggles to hire well-educated and professionally trained employees because the pay and benefits are not competitive enough. Because of this, the city sees a lot of turnover. Excellence and quality for the administration department means that there is a certain level of success in meeting the needs of staff and also the needs of the public by providing programs and services for all the citizens who live, work, and visit the city. It is important that these programs and services meet specifications and expectations of the city council and comply with city policies. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kim. And I was struck by what you said about how new city manager comes in with a completely different approach than the other city manager. It really reinforces what we had discussed earlier tonight, what Reggie had mentioned about when you have new leaders come in and how you can really switch cultures very quickly with the arrival of a new leader. So very well done. Any questions about Kim's presentation?
Thank you.
Okay, then we will move along with Balin, and I will give the floor to you. And again, you should be able to share your slides if you would like.
Okay. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me go ahead and go into full screen. Is it on full screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So I will be talking about the Orange County Sanitation District. And so I guess just to start off with, their overall agency mission is to protect public health and the environment by providing effective wastewater collection, treatment, and recycling. So who is OCSAN? They provide wastewater collection, treatment, and recycling services for 2.6 million people within Central and Northern Orange County. So from their map, I believe it's everyone from Irvine in and from Seal Beach in. And they manage the regional sewers for the cities in their service area that connect from residential, commercial, and industrial lines. They have two facilities, one in Huntington Beach and one in Fountain Valley, and they're governed by a 25-member board. Each one of their board members are representatives from the cities that they represent. So they are council members from their respective cities. And also they also have someone from the OC Board of Supervisors. They have two members who represent them, as well with the general manager. So OCSAN started as the Orange County Joint Outfall Sewer in 1921. After two reorganizations, they actually, in 1998, they became the Orange County Sanitation District with over 600 employees. Here we see that in 1991, they were created when it was a collaboration between the city of Anaheim and Santa Ana. In 1954, they actually became the Orange County Sanitation District. They became the County Sanitation District of Orange County because additional cities actually joined on. And that final reorganization in 1998 is when they became OCSAN to streamline their governance structure. So it was with the addition and with the formatting of their organization that they actually became who they are now. So what they do, they just as an agency, they're a wastewater treatment facility. So they take the wastewater that comes into their facility and they treat it. And they end up, after the water goes through their treatment process, we come out with a cleaner product. The water is cleaned and either discharged into the ocean or sent over to the groundwater replenishment system, which is a partnership with the Orange County Water District, which then they recycle by putting it back into the aquifers, and then it gets sent back to the cities to be reused. So this is an organizational overview of how their organization is structured. At the head, we see that it's the board of directors, and then it goes the general manager, who then oversees the agency itself with the assistance of an assistant general manager. And I think like one of the things that I really want to focus on is that they are divided up into 6 different departments. The general manager administration, which is the office, human resources, administrative service department, environmental services, engineering, and the O&M, which is operations and maintenance department. So their management practices, they operate on a micro level approach that focuses on the elements of the organization itself. They really focus on the people. So they use various tactics to do this, to engage their employees through development of their skills, through tuition reimbursement. They also use internal work incentives like the IDEA Award, which is where they reward their employees for submitting ideas on how to streamline a process that could potentially save money and or time. They also do this through core awards, which are monthly recognitions for employees for work that they do, which they essentially go above and beyond their general work duties. They also have a volunteer incentive program, which is where employees who are able to volunteer their time to go to outreach events and or Canvas and or speakers events, they receive additional perks for doing this, since it is out of their general work duties. Another thing that they do to also engage employees is ensure that they're providing good pay and or benefits for them to make it, to basically incentivize them to stay and or be, committed to the agency itself. They also work in, they focus on the units and divisions. They do this by providing clear roles within their organization. Like I mentioned before, that is divided up between the 5 departments. Those 5 departments are divided up by the concentrations where they're focusing on. So, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. They're divided up between different fields such as like sciences, finance, engineering, etc. And within each of those departments, we also have divisions, which are more centralized or focused groups, such as mechanics and or HVAC, operators, accountants, and or the public affairs team, for example. So they definitely operate within Weber's ideal bureaucracy and also Taylor scientific management. Because they are divided up through a hierarchical model within their 5 departments, we see that their executive management team, who are leaders in their respective fields, such as engineering, environmental services, finance, human resources, and operations and management and maintenance, they are the ones who are reporting back to the general manager, who then reports to the board of directors. And kind of going down the chart, we see that these divisions report back to the departments and so on. So there's a very clear vision of how the organization works and the order, I guess, from up to down. Within Taylor scientific management, they definitely have a more centralized planning control. They put a large focus on future planning, along with a lot of other agencies. They definitely put time into strategically planning ahead, 5 years and 10 years within their 5 and 10-year plan. These plans encompass additional plans that they develop on a bi-yearly basis, such as like the budget, asset management, cybersecurity, property management, and organizational advocacy and outreach. So they operate on a human relations theory. So under Foyet's organizational theory, this can be seen throughout their organization layout, because they really put the importance on selecting the right people that fit the organization. It's not just about someone who can fit the cog and or fit the role. It's definitely about someone who can mesh with the environment of the agency. And this definitely begins with the appointment of the general manager, which is selected by the board of directors. They ensure that they find someone who they believe is going to be a good fit to lead the agency, which then also puts a high importance on selecting a proper executive management team who is able to lead their departments the way that they see fit, because obviously within different concentration, there could be different ways of managing, say, a laboratory to a mechanic shop. the thing that I noticed was that they definitely put a big emphasis on finding experts within their fields that are leading the groups, but then also putting a lot of highlighting the fact that they do want their employees to continue to develop themselves and to learn more than just what their area needs. That way that they can fill various roles within the agency if needed, and or be able to work collaboratively with other teams in the agency. I think one of the reasons that they do this is because they want to be able to work together between each of their departments so that they can accomplish the overall goal, and then be able to also fully successfully get and do what their mission states that they will do. Within McGregor's theory of why, you can actually see that OCSAN fits this theory very well, because they definitely give people more liberty and trust in their work lives. They encourage them to develop their skills and find solutions. They do this by being able to adopt a work environment where the employees feel like they are necessary, but they are also being challenged in ways where they're respected and or being compensated properly, and or they gain more out of it than maybe like they would at some other agency. So within systems theory, I believe they have an open systems. We see that OCSAN is continuously adapting to its environment. They do have a large focus on their external environment. This means focusing on the ratepayers, board of directors, technology, environment, material, and / contractor costs. In order for them to survive, I guess, in a way, there are multiple aspects that have to go into the agency and have to align to make sure that they are continuously running, that they have staff who can actually manage the facility, and that the board of directors is also supporting their direction. So I think that this organization itself, their impact, it seems that they focus on being excellent in whatever they're doing. We see this through their awards and honors, and we see this also through partnerships, project completions, a positive financial stance, their environmental impact, and the perception of the ratepayers. So it seems like it's really important to them to not only do the work, but to show that they are doing the work by either getting recognized by agencies or different organizations that mention and kind of legitimize that they are moving in the right direction, they are properly using public funds, and et cetera. They also do this through partnerships in order to develop different projects to maybe like push the boundaries on doing something new that could potentially benefit the public. And we also see this through just their completion rate of projects that they have. And I think the biggest thing is that they also focus a lot on their perception. They don't really need, I guess, like the involvement of the ratepayers, but because they are the ratepayers, it's always important to show what they are doing and that it is vital to the county and to the ratepayers themselves. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Van. Questions or observations? Very well done. I think you incorporate all the theories together very well, and your slides are great. I always put to shame during these presentations with how good your slides always are. So very well done.
Thank you.
Okay, and then we will go with the sale. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. All right, so I am presenting today on an organization, but before I do that, I just want to kind of give an overview of what we're going to be chatting about, which through the other presentations, we know we're going to have information about the background, the intro of the org, And then we're going to go through the steps of all of the different theories that we've learned throughout this course. And so for the organization that I'm going to be discussing, it's called Waymakers. It used to be called oh my gosh, what was their name? Community Service Programs when I worked with them. And so it's a nonprofit support and guidance to individuals and families that are in need. And their primary focus is on promoting safety and justice. So a lot of individuals who work either in social services or law enforcement may know who they are. Waymakers offers a wide range of services and programs aimed at addressing various societal issues. And their goal is really to improve the overall well-being of the community. It was founded in 1972, so they've been around for a while. You see the little emblem on there, it's 50 years. And their mission is to build safer communities through strength, stability after conflicts or crisis. And with over 18 programs, and it employs over 200 people, their major functions are prevention, intervention, and postvention. So prevention services are designated to prevent social issues from occurring in the first place. And this includes programs such as youth diversion programs, or which aim to divert at-risk youth from criminal justice systems. And they actually have a couple of youth shelters. So if you have runaways, they can potentially be placed there for a short-term period. They also have intervention services, which are focused on addressing issues that have already occurred. And this is, for example, we're talking about counseling for crime survivors, mediation, if you're going through criminal, I'm sorry, not criminal, but civil cases, legal support, and individuals that are in crisis after criminal activity services, and they're known for their counseling, advocacy, and emergency shelter to survivors of sexual assault. And finally, the postvention. I don't know if you've all heard of that term before, but these are services to help individuals and families cope with the aftermath of a crisis. And this includes support groups and guidance to help manage the emotional and psychological impact of an event, referrals to resources out in the community, crisis counseling, orientation to a criminal justice system, and assistance in understanding how to get compensated for any crime-related expenses. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on sexual assault victim services. Specific program, like I mentioned, their purpose is to help sexual assault victims in Orange County through crisis intervention, emergency assistance, and relocation and reimbursement, as well as support groups and support throughout the criminal justice system. And should a district attorney file charges on the cases, they really follow that case through to completion and beyond. They have a traditional pyramid hierarchy structure with about 10 employees. And they also run the Grave Crisis Center, which means responding to hotline calls 24 hours a day, and also responding to the hospital whenever law enforcement needs to take in an individual to get an exam done for forensics. Of the 4 models of organizational effectiveness, there was a nexus between rational and human relations model. However, SAVS is mostly aligned with the internal process model. The unit is heavily reliant on information, communication, structure, stability, and control. It actually is like that for most of the units, if not all of them, within Waymakers. And I think it's because they started with a partnership with law enforcement back in 1972. And so it seems like they used and leaned on those traditional models from law enforcement, the rigidity structure, and then just implemented in their own organization. The integrative functions are needed to coordinate and control work activities. The street bureaucrats are provided with directives to follow to ensure that as much consistency as possible is there in the services, because all of the situations are really unreliable and they can provide different strenuous circumstances. These management practices are communicated through many rules and guidelines that must be followed to ensure that any volunteer or employee that are engaging in these practices could have as close to a similar outcome as possible. So for example, when a victim was brought into the emergency room for a forensic exam, there were several actions that must be taken before the end of the exam, and you had to follow these to a T. Police will take a report, the nurse will take samples and provides medication, advocates will provide resources and new clothing and inform of rights. And although, like I mentioned, each situation had its varieties, we really had to provide all of these resources in order to be compliant with what our grants were asking of us. The six mechanisms for coordination and control, the most commonly used mechanism was a standardization of work process. I will probably have just put in place, and this was again to help standardize the work product and trying to achieve the organization's goals. So this is done to help the worker be more efficient and how to best perform their assigned tasks. Another example is that once a case is assigned to an advocate has strict guidelines from documenting the statistics on the case, documenting, opening documents to have victim information in a confidential database, contacting the victim within a specific timeline, providing a specific set of services and information, and the mapping just continues with the future follow-ups. Of the 4 motivational strategies, SAVs normally motivates its employees through legal compliance. Again, using those rules and formal direct code from law enforcement. This is sensitive and confidential information that was many times bound to criminal investigations and HIPAA compliance. The other motivational strategy was job identification. Offering work that was very interesting and emotionally challenging was something that is a common theme of the work, but the work was intrinsically rewarding. And so most of the employees, very rarely was there one that wasn't there because they wanted to do the work to help survivors, but it was just super fulfilling. And I remember being in a court case with a female victim in her early teens who was just terrified of testifying, as most clients typically were. And she did find it comforting to be surrounded by a team of women. So we had a district attorney, assistant district attorney who's female, the district attorney investigator, the detective, even the law enforcement officer that first took her case, and then there was me, and she actually ended up drawing like the power puff as a like thank you, because we were her team of women that were supporting her through the process. When looking at Wilberian ideal bureaucracy, there are several principles that we're seeing within SAVs. There's a structured hierarchy with the program director implementing the policies that have been trickled down by the supervisors that then delegate that to the staff and the volunteers. And as I mentioned and stressed, the rules must be followed to ensure compliance with grant requirements, rape crisis center standards, legal and HIPAA regulations. So there really isn't a lot of room for error here. All policies and procedures are written and updated to ensure the most recent policies are enforced. So this means there's a great deal of institutional rigidity. As a rather large organization with a rich regulatory changes occur or something happens with a grant that was given. When looking at scientific management, although SAVs does not engage in a time setting or time motion studies, it does believe in the standardization of work. So for example, when a new case referral comes through, the advocate has a specific amount of time in which they need to respond via phone. It has to be via phone. If a phone call is made and there's no response, a physical letter must be mailed out within a specific number of days. Once you do make contact with the victim, there are very specific referrals that must be made. You know, you have to make sure that they got information for crisis counseling or therapists. You have to look at what resources are in the community. Do they need housing assistance? Do they need relocation services? So you have to be very prescriptive in the information that you're providing. And subsequently, every interaction thereafter must be counted and documented for granting reporting purposes. Once the case moves towards the criminal justice process, there's a whole slew of other sets of standards that must be reached. And likewise, the victim is engaging in crisis counseling that has to be documented as crisis. Effectively, specialized departments have been created to take on these jobs. As a victim of a crime, you can have crime-related expenses reimbursed to you by the state of California. And in order to have the optimal opportunity to have a victim's application approved, SAV utilizes the Victims Compensation Program Unit to gather and submit all the necessary documents on behalf of the victim. So this unit was really specialized in making sure that all of the documentation was in order so that it can be then submitted to the state. Along the same vein, under the principles of management, the division of work is similar to the task specialization mentioned by Taylor. It's evident that the staff at SAVs engages in subordination of individual interests to general interests, which means that sometimes in overnight shifts to hospital responses or even to hotline calls. And there's a psychological factor into buying into that mission of the organization because the employees, again, are so passionate about assisting individuals that they're willing to put aside their personal time to make sure that these individuals are being assisted regardless of the time that they're being served. Now, when we're going to talk about human relations theory, I know that there's a lot of pre-HR theory that Follett was involved in, so I would be remiss if I didn't kind of touch on this. So Follett's principles of constructive conflict resolution are super evident in SAVS. The organization uses these practices to navigate potential tensions arising from diverse needs, interests, and expectations for its clients and partners. Think about like working with law enforcement, district attorney, counselors, social workers, legal resources. There's a lot of people with very differing opinions of perceiving the conflicts as detrimental. Waymakers really encourages open dialogue and seeks mutually beneficial solutions. So this approach is not only there to foster positive relationships, but it also cultivates a supportive work environment. This further exemplifies Follett's theory of interpenetration, taking into account perspectives that are really outside of groupthink. So, you know, even though I didn't think that one specific server was really important, after talking to that service agency, I realized the importance of that. And so just incorporating different opportunities to ultimately help survivors. And Waymakers really does integrate collaboration effectively when engaging various stakeholders, including community members, partner organizations, and governmental attention. Ultimately, though, I think they could do a better job at pulling that interpersonal interpenetration collaboration inverse into the company. And I'll get to that in a little bit. So Mayo looks beyond the surface and brings in the psychological effects that workers may be experiencing and how that affects their work. So for advocates at SAVS, all of them work in this field because they're passionate, or at least the majority of them. And some of the individuals were also sexual survivors as well. And so these experiences and passions help employees connect to each other and to the work that they are engaging. This positive attitude towards each other and the work is similar to the relay assembly test room experiment, where one of the primary causes of increased work productivity is that the group's social environment is a productive or positive one. So workers really enjoy the camaraderie and the heightened sense of self-worth that the team has to offer. And I can honestly say I probably lasted longer in that unit because of the individuals that I worked with, because the work was really heavy and dense. This lends itself to Roethlisberger's thoughts on the process of organizations acting as social systems. So one major component of seeing organizations as such is that the need to have that open communication and active listening to really understand what's happening within the employees' lives and how that affects work and reaching the goals of the organization. In SAVS, the lateral relationships forge empathetic and open bonds with rich levels of communication. This was highly vital to the team as we were all dealing with difficult subjects. However, listening and communicating didn't always occur vertically, which is one of the points that would probably need to be expanded upon. Taking Bernard's learnings and the natural system theory can best describe SAVS. I really vacillated between both of these options, and I ended up landing here. And I think it's more of a reactive environment, and making changes to the programs are really based off of either the community's needs changing or evolving, or it could be political, legislative changes, or even grant changes. So very much embedded into its current changes. In a drastic example, if funding was running low or a grant was not renewed, the organization would consider removing parts of the programming or personnel, or seek funding that was not necessarily aligned to the mission to continue its survival. And that happened to me. One of my roles was actually cut because funding ended. According to Barnard, this is a rather defensive or reactive response versus open systems theory, which positions the organization as ready to transform themselves or their environment conditions to reach equilibrium. So with organizational excellence, again, I touched on how really great Waymakers is as a whole in working with external community. The partnerships that are forged are impeccable. I mean, you have to, they also are good at adapting when those changes happen from the external factor. And when it comes to conflict resolution, I've had first-hand seats at what happens when one agency thinks that what they're doing is more important than the other agency. You have to come together and really be the referee. Going down to interpersonal, where they can do a little bit more work, is the areas that they could reach is the internal piece. Going back to looking at their employees and looking at how they can value them either through monetary compensation. I know after I left, there was a huge raise across the board because they realized that they were severely underpaying their staff. Retaining professional staff through active listening and professional growth. They have a very good, robust opportunity to make individuals go to training so that they can level up in the role, but offering the opportunity to do it in a consistent and a manner that more people can do it versus just a few at a time. That's one of the few ways that they can definitely reach that level of excellence. And that's the end of my presentation.
Good. Thank you very much. Well done. Very comprehensive and covered all the required elements and incorporate the theories very well. It is important to see, it is interesting to see how organizations respond to challenges from their environment. And there's actually a really interesting body of literature that looks at organization stagnation, decline, and how there are different strategies that organizations use to respond to an environment that perhaps doesn't have the same levels of support that it used to have. And so there's a lot of literature out there on organizations that we're not able to get into in this course. We're just kind of like getting that tip of the iceberg, but very well done, very comprehensive. The microphone was a little glitchy here and there, but I know that does happen. It's always interesting to hear the buffering as that catches up and then slows down, but that happens, and that happens to my microphone every now and then as well. But very well done, nice presentation. Any questions or any comments on the presentation other than excellent work? Okay, thank you very much. Those are the three presentations we have scheduled for this evening. Is there anyone else who feels they would like to go at this point in time? You don't have to, but I would throw it out there. Okay, if not, then next week we will dedicate the entire session to presentations. Again, if there's anyone who would like to go early on next week and kind of get it out of the way at the beginning of the session, feel free to send me an email, and then I'll do a first come, first serve. Otherwise, we'll just go alphabetically through the cohort and do as many presentations as we can. I'm an optimist, but I'm not enough of an optimist to think that we're going to do all the presentations next week. I just don't think we have enough time. So all the presentations we don't get done, we'll finish that up on Saturday. And then also in that Saturday session, once we get through the presentations with whatever time we have left, then I'll go back over some of this information for 697 that we had talked about last week and just make sure everyone's comfortable with how 697 is working, and then take any questions you may have about 697, because the official start of the first section, 697, is in the following week on June the 24th. Okay? Thank you very much. Hope you all have a great remainder of your week. I'll get this recording up onto our Canvas site by tomorrow morning, and then next week we'll be back at it with our presentations. So thanks again. Have a great week. Talk to you next Wednesday. Bye-bye. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.